The night air smelled of damp asphalt, mingling with the metallic odor of the storm looming over the city. James Carter shoved his hands into his pockets, pulling his hood deeper over his face, but he knew it wouldn't help. Nothing would help. Not in this neighborhood, not with his skin. Long before he heard the siren wail, James sensed that he was already being followed. An instantaneous hunch, that animal instinct that had been developing in his blood for years, like an echo of the past. He quickened his step, but knew it was useless. The cars were already slowing down, cutting the night street with flashing red and blue lights. The wheels came to a screeching halt, and the doors swung open like the jaws of a hungry beast. Two policemen, both stout, broad-shouldered, white, moved toward him as if everything had been decided. "Hands up! On the ground now!" The officer's voice, full of authority and confidence, sounded like a sentence. Before James could even blink, a heavy hand slammed into his chest, knocking the air out of him. He collapsed to the sidewalk, his knees crunching from the impact, his palms scraping against the concrete. "What happened?" He squeaked out, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the night. "Shut up. Face down." His knee pressed into his back with such force that the air rushed out of his lungs. The metal of the handcuffs slammed into his wrists, leaving instant red marks. James felt the coldness creeping up his skin through his clothes, but he knew. It wasn't the weather. It was the cold of fear. "What did I do?" "You know what you did, nigger." Those words. A muffled thump in his chest. James clenched his teeth, absorbing the anger, the resentment, but he didn't let it break through. He already knew that resisting wouldn't change anything. A third officer stepped out of the vehicle. He slowly approached, pulled out his baton, and lazily pressed it against his shoulder. "What's up, asshole? Did you take a walk?" He smirked, leaning closer. His breath smelled of coffee and booze. "We're looking for a guy who's been running roughshod over this place. You fit the description." "What description?" James asked, trying to speak calmly. The officer smirked. Black, hooded. The loud laughter of the other two cops tore through the night. James closed his eyes. He knew this was only the beginning. The tightness of the cell was stifling. The walls were crushing, and the air seemed soaked with sweat and fear. James sat on the cold bench, feeling the handcuffs leave marks on his wrists. The night at the station was endless. He didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, but because he knew this nightmare wasn't over. Behind the iron bars, the officers were talking among themselves. They were talking loud enough for him to hear. "Just another nigger who got unlucky." "Yeah, but at least he's quiet, not squealing like the others." "You should have seen the way he looked when we threw him to the ground. Like a dog who knows his master's gonna hit him anyway." Laughter, loud, obnoxious laughter, as if they hadn't been taught that people could have dignity. At dawn, he was dragged out of his cell and thrown into a van without even explaining where he was being taken. The smell of rusted metal and dried blood wafted up his nose. On either side of him sat two other detainees, one a Hispanic man with a busted lip, the other a white guy in an expensive suit who looked as if he had gotten here by accident. "What's wrong with you?" the Hispanic man asked hoarsely. James remained silent. He already knew the answer. The van stopped abruptly, and the door opened with a rattle. Outside, another world awaited, a world where he was not a man, but a defendant, a trial. "You're already guilty." He was led into a hall where the prosecutor didn't even bother to look at him. The papers were already on the table. The verdict, in fact, had been reached before the hearing. Charged with armed robbery and assault. James clenched his fists. He'd never even held a gun in his life. The prosecutor, a white man with sleek, carefully styled hair, lazily flipped through the case like he was reading a menu in a cafe. According to the victim, the attacker was... He pretended to think, then grinned. Black, medium height, wearing a hoodie. The hood. That damn hood. "Are you guys serious?" For the first time ever, James couldn't take it anymore. His voice rang out in the courtroom. "You arrested me just because I'm black and walking down the street?" Silence. The judge, a gray-haired man in his 60s, cast a cold glance at him over his glasses. "Keep your emotions in check, Mr. Cartwright. Otherwise, I will be forced to issue a warning for disorderly conduct." James felt something inside him break. The judge didn't look surprised. The judge didn't look at him with sympathy. The judge just wanted this case to go as quickly as possible. The prosecutor leaned into the microphone. "I request that the accused be remanded to immediate custody pending further proceedings." "You can't be innocent." James didn't even have time to open his mouth before the clanking of handcuffs could be heard behind him. His hands were taken again. Again, they squeezed him like an iron trap. He looked out into the audience. No one stood up for him. No one questioned. To them, he was already guilty. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you or someone you know had something similar in their life. Your thoughts and opinions are very important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. James couldn't hide the tension burning him from the inside as he was led through the corridors of the court. There were walls of engravings, statues, and ancient paintings, but they didn't protect him. They seemed to confine him in this space where his words meant nothing, where his life, like the lives of all people like him, was but a small fragment in a spinning wheel of injustice. Every step in this room was a step into a cage, and his cage wasn't metal, it was invisible. It started in his soul and shrank with every look, every word. The policemen standing on either side of him were like watching a caged animal. Their eyes did not hide their contempt, their bodies, their rigidity. They were not here to seek the truth. They were here to break him, to make him a victim of a system that left no room for justice. Just as that night they had thrown him to the ground, so now he was the one who had to suffer, with no proof, no witnesses, just because he was black. As he was led into the courtroom, James felt all eyes immediately stop on him. Everyone knew who he was, and his skin was their verdict. There was nothing in that courtroom that could help him. The judge, clutching a restrained grudge, seemed to have already reached his verdict before he saw his face. His gaze was cold-blooded, as if this trial was just another formal affair. The prosecutor was too busy with his papers, but when his gaze happened to cross James's, he felt an icy wave of contempt engulf him. "You are charged with robbery and assault, and you already know that all the evidence is against you." The prosecutor's words sounded like a cold sentence. He didn't even look in his direction. His voice was firm and mechanical. James looked at him, but there was no fear in his eyes. He knew that to them he was guilty from the start. His skin was proof enough to convict. His life wasn't the price. He was just another wrong person caught up in the system. The horror of that realization was so profound that for a moment he felt the world around him begin to blur. The judge, a white man in an expensive suit, looked up from his papers and looked James over, his face completely impassive. "Prosecutor, you may proceed." His voice sounded dry like rusty metal. James, unable to stand it, stepped in, even though he realized it wouldn't change anything. "How can you accuse me when you don't have a single piece of evidence?" His voice sounded like he was trying to shout through the walls that surrounded him. There was only a cruel laugh in response from the prosecutor, who gestured at him. His words were not heeded. He was a nigger who deserved no defense or compassion. He knew he was nothing more than just another defendant in this room. "You're already guilty, kid. It's just a question of how long you're going to keep resisting." The prosecutor's words were quiet but venomous. As the prosecutor continued his tirade, James noticed how every look directed at him was full of contempt. Even the lawyer who was supposed to be defending him looked at him like a lost soul, not trying to argue the obvious. He knew it didn't matter how much he said. The judge had already decided. The prosecutor had already decided. And James was just part of that game. All he had was his truth. It was his weapon, his only defense. But behind every pity, behind every word that might have made the slightest difference in his fate, he felt his soul being torn apart. There was no room for justice in this room. He would not be heard. He would not be understood. He was a stranger among them, and all that was left was to endure, not letting his hatred consume him completely. When the judge ruled, James remained where he was, unmoving, not showing that even at this moment he was still in control. He was not defeated, but everyone around him was trying to destroy him. It was a cage he could not survive in. Or maybe he already knew that in the cage he was gaining power. Power that would burn them all. The policeman, standing next to James, stood confidently, as if the whole world were beneath their feet. They were sure that this case, like any other, would bring them no consequences. They felt no fear, only pride in their victory. The power's on their side, and they couldn't let a man like James, a black man who didn't even deserve a name, they thought, escape this trap. "Did you see his face?" said an officer with the last name James, after they had locked James in the cell. "As soon as he saw us, he knew he was dead. He knew we'd catch him. So all he has to do is sit there and shut up." Officer James stood with a confident expression on his face, glancing at his colleagues. The other police officers looked at each other and smirked. To them, this case was routine. They didn't think of James as a person. In their eyes, he was just another object, a tool for their own pleasures. "See, he didn't even try to fight back," said another officer, Marcus. "When we grabbed him, he didn't try to run like all the other blacks we catch. He already knew no one was going to save him. It's as if he was born to sit here in prison." James didn't hear them talking. His thoughts were elsewhere. He sat in solitary confinement, feeling the cold concrete seeping into his body. But even here, among these four walls, where his life seemed completely dependent on someone else's will, he knew his struggle was not over. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was the embodiment of resistance. While James endured these hours of humiliation and isolation, the police officers enjoyed discussing his future. They knew that the system would never punish them for the actions they had committed. They were confident that their status in society as defenders of the law would give them immunity. "You know, I like it when guys like him get caged. These guys think they can change everything, but in reality, we just keep them quiet," Marcus said with a smirk. "Look at his face when he thinks his defense is going to work. He doesn't even know that his fate is already sealed." There was no regret in their words, only mockery and arrogance. They looked at James like an animal they could do whatever they wanted to. They thought James was worthless. His life didn't matter to them. All they saw was another opportunity to feel their power, their untouchability. Officers James and Marcus sat at a table in the patrol car, eating their lunch with plastic containers, not thinking about what was going on with the man they had apprehended. They didn't care. They felt right, their hands were clean, and the system was always on their side. They followed its laws, but they knew that the same system would never punish them for their cruelty. "Dude, I know we don't have to worry about him breaking out," Officer James said, rubbing his hands together. "Even if he can prove something, we have ways to handle it. And who's gonna believe him?" "He's just a nigger, James. You know what I mean?" Marcus said, glancing disdainfully toward the cell where James was sitting. "He'll never be anything more than what we made him. He can't beat the system. The system is us." And that laugh again, heavy, mocking, penetrating. James, sitting in his dark corner, was used to their words. He knew that this system worked against him, that the cops didn't even see him as a person. They only see a face, a skin color that gives them the right to be cruel. But, in his heart, he knew he could not keep silent any longer. With every word they said, he felt an unbearable rage flaring inside him. But now, even if these policemen believed they had impunity, James knew he would fight to the last man. With every look, with every word, with every gesture of these men, his resolve only grew stronger. He knew his story would not end here. The courtroom froze as the massive door of the judge's room swung open and the judge entered the room. All talk died down, people stood up, and tension hung in the air. James, sitting handcuffed behind the defendant's desk, felt his heart stop for a moment. This man. He knew him. But from where? The judge was tall, with a commanding posture, his cold gray eyes studying the hall. His face expressed nothing but indifference, and his stern features emphasized the severity of his character. He sat down, folding his hands carefully in front of him, and only then slowly raised his gaze to the accused. That look. James felt something inside him flip. The judge wasn't just looking at him as a defendant. There was something strange in his gaze, like he recognized him but didn't let it show, like there was something unresolved between them. But before James could remember how he knew him, a commanding voice sounded. "Please be seated. Court is now in session." There was a resounding lowering of people, and the judge turned his attention to the documents. "Now, the defendant is James Cartwright, 38 years old. The charge is armed robbery and assault." He said it as if the charges had already been proven, like there was no point in even starting this trial. "Prosecutor, please." The prosecutor stood up, a tall man with a smug smile that said he had already won this case. "Your Honor, this man is a criminal. He assaulted and robbed a white citizen. There is a description that matches his appearance. We believe the evidence is sufficient to convict." James couldn't believe the audacity of it. "What's the description? A black-hooded man?" His voice broke with anger, but before he could say anything else, the judge raised his hand. "Defendant, if you want your attorney to present your defense, behave accordingly." His voice was hard, icy. James felt anger boiling up inside him. He couldn't remember how he knew the judge, but he knew one thing. The man wasn't on his side. "So, I'm supposed to keep quiet while I'm accused of something I didn't do? You must keep order in the courtroom or I will have you removed." The judge looked at him in a way that sent a chill down James's spine. That look. It wasn't the same as the prosecutors or the cops, but there was something similar about it. The prosecutor continued, "Your Honor, we'd also like to point out that the defendant has a history of trouble with the law. He I wasn't convicted," James shouted, but immediately felt the officers on either side of him squeeze his shoulders, warning him not to move. The judge, without taking his eyes off the papers, said slowly, "Stop that shouting, Mr. Cartwright, or I'll have you escorted out." James gritted his teeth. He could feel everything inside him boiling, but something kept him from breaking free. Not just fear, something else. And then it hit him. He recalled. This was a man he had known since he was a child. This judge was once a nobody. He was just a kid. He was in the same system as James. Lived in an orphanage where the kids knew one thing. You either survive or you're broken. But this guy, he was different. He was always observing, always studying. He didn't fight like the others. He never complained. He memorized. And now he sat in the judge's chair, and his look said, "I haven't forgotten." James met his gaze, but the judge only tensed for a moment, then turned back to the papers. "We'll continue to hear the case." But James already knew. This judge is not just another white man who doesn't care. He was something more. And now James had to realize, would this man save him, or will it kill him for good? James sat in the defendant's chair, the cold metal handcuffs still rubbing his wrists. The room was filled with the muffled voices of the judge, the prosecutor, the lawyers. Their words blended into a monotonous stream that made no sense to him. His attention was fixed on only one figure. Judge, this man, Judge Edward Lawson. Now he remembered. Eddie. The memories came crashing over him in a wave, squeezing his chest, filling his heart with a strange mixture of anger, bitterness, and hope? No, there was no hope, only emptiness. The orphanage, narrow corridors that smelled musty and damp, the icy winter nights when they curled up on thin mattresses and dreamed of a different future. Eddie was a pale-skinned, skinny boy with eyes that were always looking for a way out, always looking for a way to survive. In this place, survival was the cardinal rule. Those too weak would break. Those too loud faded away. But the two of them stuck together. They were different. One black, one white, but equally broken, equally unwanted. They grumbled about the system, dreamed of the future, promised each other they would never be like these adults who had betrayed them. And now. James stared at him, sitting in his black robe, his hair impeccably styled, his gaze cold and his lips pressed into a thin line. This was not the Eddie he remembered, but in that look, in that fleeting trembling of his fingers as he flipped through the papers, he remembered. "Are you part of the system, Eddie?" James looked at him and couldn't figure it out. Was this man in front of him his friend or his judge? His voice came out softly, but the room was so quiet that every word cut like a knife. "Have we met before, Judge Lawson?" He saw the judge freeze for a moment. Only a moment. Eddie slowly lifted his eyes from the papers, looked straight at him, and spoke. "I don't know the defendant. Let's focus on the merits of the case." James felt something shiver inside him. Eddie did it deliberately. He cut himself off from the past. James felt anger flaring in his chest. Had he really become part of this system? The system they had sworn together to fight against? "So, you don't remember?" he whispered. Eddie heard him. He saw it in his eyes. But the judge was staring down at the papers again. "Let's not deviate from the trial. Proceed, prosecutor." "We're all traitors, aren't we?" The prosecutor, pleased with this turn of events, smirked and continued. "The defendant is a typical representative of the criminal environment. He has been arrested for disorderly conduct in the past. He lives in a high-crime neighborhood. We believe he committed this crime." James gritted his teeth. "You're not even trying to hide your racism, are you?" The prosecutor merely shrugged his shoulders. "Gentlemen, let's not make this a race issue. We're talking about crime, not skin color. But, if anything, the statistics speak for themselves." Laughter in the hall. The journalist wrote something down in his notebook. "He's not even a person to them, just a statistic." James turned to the judge. "Are you really going to keep quiet? Do you see what's going on?" Eddie didn't answer, but his hands trembled. He remembered. "I remembered their nights in the orphanage. I remembered how they were beaten by the caretakers, how they hid from social workers who saw them as nothing more than trash to be donated. He remembered how they had promised each other that they would never be the ones to betray. But he betrayed. James could see it in his eyes. The pain of silence. Judge Lawson tapped his gavel. Order in the courtroom. But he couldn't hide the cold sweat on his temples. He felt like saying, "I can't help you, James." But the words stuck in his throat. He knew he couldn't just stand up and say, "This man is innocent." The system would have broken him just like everyone else. But he knew the truth. And now James was looking at him with one single question. Will you save me? Or will you kill me? Let's pause for one more brief pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you or someone you know has had something similar in their life. Your thoughts and opinions are important to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The courtroom was filled with a strange feeling. A slight, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. It came from the judge. He was no longer just a cool observer of the proceedings. Judge Lawson began to transform himself. His gaze became hard, and every gesture, every pause in his speech made those present shrink back in their chairs. He acted as if he held not only the law, but an invisible but powerful responsibility on his shoulders. The judge became a shadow that slowly but surely descended on those involved in the case. And James noticed it. He saw how the policemen, who had looked at him with confidence from the beginning, were now beginning to feel confused. Their gazes became less confident, and they began to move nervously in their seats. There was a look of confusion in their eyes as they began to realize that this process would not be like all the others. Witness, please confirm that you are confident in your testimony. Judge Lawson's voice was hoarse but calm. The witness, one of the officers who arrested James, floundered, as if thinking for the first time that his words might not be enough. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm sure this person was at the location where the incident occurred." But the judge was silent. He was in no hurry to answer, scrutinizing the officer. His gaze was cold, impenetrable. He did not take his eyes off the policeman, and it made him confused. The judge slowly picked up the papers and leafed through them while the whole room remained in tense silence. "I realize this is a common thing for you. You're used to blaming people without evidence, just because they're black. You thought James Cartwright was just another target to pin all the blame on. And you don't care that he may be innocent. It's all about the convenience of your power." The judge's voice became hard. Everyone in the room felt the tension reaching its peak. The policemen were getting visibly nervous. One of them twitched as if he wanted to say something, but his look at the judge immediately silenced him. It was a look that said, "If you say a word, you'll be guilty." James sat in the defendant's chair and looked at the judge, trying to figure out what was going on. He realized that the judge wasn't just doing his job anymore. Judge Lawson was part of this conspiracy, part of those who were working to turn the situation against those who had no voice. And now he himself was now on the side where he could decide who was right and who was just a victim. But here's what changed. He was no longer on the side of this system. The judge, in his silent resistance, was bringing down not only punishment but guilt on those who thought they could control everything. You talk about this man assaulting a citizen, but you can't even imagine how the person you are chasing feels. The judge lashed out at the police officers with an even sharper tone. You think you are entitled to authority just because you wear a uniform, but you don't realize that you are becoming part of a system that destroys people without thinking that they are human beings. The voices of the police officers began to sound more nervous. Your Honor, it's just... One of the officers tried to justify himself, but his words stuck in his throat. Judge Lawson interrupted him with a hard look. Quiet. The hall fell into silence again. The prosecutor, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, tried to intervene, but Lawson gave him no word. Don't. I've had enough of your words. Everyone knows that you have only one goal in mind, to maintain your power and make sure that no shadow of suspicion falls on you. Suddenly, as if out of the blue, the judge announced, I'm suspending this trial. There will be no conviction. I demand that all evidence be reviewed, and I am appointing an independent inquiry into the actions of the police officers in this case. There was silence in the hall. James felt his chest fill with air. It was an unexpected and powerful decision, one that seemed to knock down all the confidence of the police officers. The policemen stood as if hypnotized. They couldn't believe that someone they thought was easily controllable, someone who could simply be destroyed, was the one who could now destroy everything they thought they had impunity for. The look on Judge Lawson's face was the final blow that dispelled their confidence. James didn't know what would happen next, but he felt one thing. The real fight was about to begin. James sat in his chair, his hands still cuffed, but they didn't seem so heavy anymore. He could feel the tension in the courtroom rising. Judge Lawson was in no hurry to make a decision, his gaze cold, focused. He wasn't just watching the proceedings. He knew that what he was doing now could affect the entire system. But for James, this was more than just a lawsuit. It was more than that. As something in his body began to boil, as his thoughts finally came together, he realized he wasn't just looking for justice. He finally felt he could reclaim what had long been taken from him, his honor. And this fight wasn't just revenge, it was a return to himself. The time of reckoning had come. The policemen sitting in the hall felt the ground slipping away from under their feet. They could not understand what was happening. For all their years of work, they had gotten used to the fact that any trial involving a black defendant would end predictably for the latter. They were sure they would sit in their chairs with a sense of impunity, waiting for the judge to hand down a sentence similar to all the others. They were ready for it. But it didn't happen. The policemen were beginning to feel that their actions were being severely scrutinized. Judge Lawson, without uttering a word, went deeper and deeper into the details of the case. He turned the pages slowly, scrutinizing every document, every protocol, every touch. He was in no hurry. He seemed to be deliberately prolonging the moment, making it clear that everything would be different now. This process was no longer a formality, no longer a predictable outcome. It was more than that. James noticed one of the officers swaying nervously in his seat, and the other even began to rub the edges of his uniform. They could not believe that the trial had not gone as they had expected. These cruel, unyielding men, who were used to suppressing and humiliating, now sat like schoolchildren in front of a strict teacher who knew their secrets. Even the prosecutor, still trying to maintain a semblance of confidence, glanced at the judge several times. He did not know how the trial would develop further, and this was his first defeat. James, despite the tension and fear, felt his heart beating faster. His gaze grew more determined with each passing moment. This was the moment of truth. He knew that events were unfolding before his eyes that could change everything, both his life and the lives of others in his position. This judge, this man who had been part of the very world that was supposed to destroy him, was now becoming his ally. The judge didn't want to be part of the system that had burned his childhood. He was not only a judge in this room, he was a witness who could no longer remain silent. The police officers were getting nervous. They knew that their actions were now being scrutinized. The judge had become their worst nightmare. He was silent, but his silence was as heavy as stone. With every glance he gave them, they felt their confidence melt away. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't understand why this trial was not like the others. Why was their impunity suddenly gone? One of the officers, the one who had first arrested James, coughed, trying to hide his nervousness. He looked at his colleague, but he too was eclipsed by fear. Their words couldn't take it all back. These men, who were used to walking on their heads, now felt their own past starting to haunt them. They couldn't believe that James and Judge Lawson could change the outcome of a case like this. How can you claim that he committed a crime when there is not a single witness, not a single piece of evidence other than your word? Asked the judge, finally looking up at the prosecutor. His voice was even, but there was a sense of menace in it. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a warning. The prosecutor froze, not knowing how to answer. He had been sure the prosecution was strong enough to convict, but now he was beginning to doubt. The judge, who had his whole life seen how the system worked, was now clearly on James's side. He could no longer continue to remain silent. His actions spoke louder than words. You see his skin, and you don't need anything else. You want him guilty because it's convenient for you. But who are you to decide whose life is worth more and whose is worth less? The judge continued, and his words cut into the hearts of those present, including James. He knew those words weren't just to them. It was to him and his past as well. It was about how the system wanted to trample people without noticing their human dignity. James felt his soul come alive as the block that had been shrinking him inside began to crack and splinter. He wasn't just a victim. He was a man who deserved the truth, and he could feel that truth coming out, finding its way despite all the obstacles. The judge, though holding back his emotions, was clearly on his side. And now that that support was evident, James knew. His future would not be as he'd been promised. The trial was coming to its finale. He did not know how the day would end, but he knew one thing. Now, in this room, a new fight was beginning, and he was ready to fight. When Judge Lawson uttered these words, there was a silence in the hall that was even louder than the loudest shout. This was not just an unexpected statement. It was a genuine shock. The prosecutor fell silent, and the policemen sitting at their desks seemed petrified. Their confidence, their sense of absolute impunity, which they wore like armor, crumbled like sand blown away by a storm. They couldn't believe their ears. It was a moment they could not have imagined, not because they had not thought of the consequences, but because they had never experienced their actions being put to such a brutal test. The police officers who made this arrest will be held accountable. The judge said these words without moving his eyebrows. He didn't even take a second to pause, as if it were obvious to everyone. But for the officers, it was more than a shock. It was a blow to the very heart of their righteousness, their power. One of the policemen stepped forward, his face pale. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He glanced at his colleagues, but they too were as stunned as he was. One of them, the same officer who had led the arrest of James, stood up abruptly and looked at the judge, his gaze full of aggression and bewilderment. "Are you crazy? That's impossible. We were only doing our job." The policeman's voice shook, but the anger was obvious. He couldn't believe that such words could come from a judge who was part of the system that supported them. Judge Lawson did not answer, but his gaze was so cold that the policeman realized at once that he could not suppress this trial. He saw Lawson looking at him as if he were just another criminal whose gaze could not hold the truth for a moment. James watched this scene and, despite his inner tension, felt his shoulders relax. He was sitting in the defendant's chair, and it was his only seat, but he suddenly felt that he was no longer in submission. He wasn't just a victim. He was someone who now controlled his own destiny. This trial was his, and the judge was on his side, though he didn't say so openly. But the look in that man's eyes spoke more than all words. There were whispers in the hall. Some people looked in surprise at the policeman who had been allowed to go unpunished for so long. There was an awkwardness in their every movement now, as if they were children caught up in some crime they did not realize they had committed. The officers could not believe that their own behavior was now on display. The word racism was in the air, though no one said it out loud. But the word was everywhere, in their gestures, in their looks, in the way they tried to justify themselves even when they could say nothing. One of the officers, with his hands in his lap, stirred restlessly, but his gaze was no longer confident. He looked at James, but his gaze was blank, devoid of his former aggression. James noticed his hands begin to shake slightly as they clenched into fists. This officer, who had once given no thought to what he could do to a man, now realized that his own actions would be judged by another man, a man he himself had once thought invisible. James felt strangely relieved. His inner voice, which had been silent for so long, was now filled with power. These police officers, who used their power to destroy and humiliate, could no longer look at him with such contempt. This was their downfall. This was their punishment. Judge Lawson did not speed up the process. He took another pause, leafing through the documents and making it clear that his decision did not depend on how long it would take to get it done. He was in no hurry. He knew the police officers needed to get a feel for this moment. They had to realize that they wouldn't get away with it this time. They had to feel their own power and pride turning into a burden they couldn't carry. The police officers tried to justify themselves, but their words had no power. They tried to talk about their merits, about how they were protecting the city, about their commitment to the law, but their words did not ring true. They all realized that their actions were not laws, but only part of a system that was destroying people. And now that system was beginning to crumble, and with it they were crumbling. James knew that police officers thought they would always remain on a pedestal. They thought that with their high positions they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. But now they stood before the court, and their faces expressed only one thing: fear. Fear that their actions would now not be forgiven. Fear that each of them would be held accountable. Judge Lawson looked up again. His face was calm, but determination burned in his eyes. "I am ordering that an investigation be conducted into the actions of these officers. They will be prosecuted for abuse of authority." His voice didn't waver. The silence that followed those words wasn't just a moment. It was the fall. It was the fall of those who thought their power was all they needed. It was the fall of oppressors who believed for a second that their power had no limits. James sat up, a furious power surging in his chest. This was his moment. The trial was over, and the silence that followed the announcement of the judgment was almost palpable. The police officers had finally been held accountable for their crimes. The officers who had once looked upon James with contempt, as if he were nothing, now stood before a court that spared them no mercy. Judge Lawson, as if pressed by the weight he had just thrown down, said not a word, as he always did, but everyone understood. This was not just a trial. It was a symbol that brought down one of the most brutal and corrupt systems. They had been punished. The law had prevailed. But for James and the judge, the victory was not absolute. For James, a black man who had endured years of humiliation, neglect, and abuse, the victory seemed sweet. He felt his chest fill with anger and his soul with relief. Revenge was sweet, but at the same time he felt the heavy burden of this journey pressing down on him. He knew that much was lost, that many dreams had long since been shattered. But he also knew that this moment was not the end. It was simply the beginning of something new, unknown, but more fierce. Judge Lawson did not raise his head when the verdict was announced. He remained in his chair as if staring into the void, absorbing the full implications of what he had done. He knew that his decision was not just an act of justice, but a foreshadowing of the destruction of the entire system of which he himself was a part. He knew that this decision would not go without consequences for him. Every step he took, every letter written in the verdict, was now his personal cross to bear. When the case was over, Lawson turned to James and their gazes crossed. The judge didn't say a word, but there was the same cold fire in his eyes that James had seen the moment he had first recognized him. There was something more than law in those eyes. It was a conscience that could not remain silent. James felt his heart beat faster as they both walked out of the courtroom. The police officers he had once faced were now in the hands of the law. But James knew that their faces would haunt him for a long time to come. These men would not simply disappear, no matter how they were punished. Their looks, their cruelty would remain in his memory forever. And though he felt victorious, this mark, this weight they had left on his soul, would never fade. As James walked out of the courthouse, his steps became more confident, but he knew there would be more challenges ahead. He felt his life had changed, but not in the way he had dreamed. He knew that winning here was not the end of his struggle. It was only a step in a long journey, a journey that could take years, maybe even his whole life. There were many questions in his mind that had no answers. He knew that his personal war with the system, with this world, was just beginning. Judge Lawson followed him out, and it was as if their paths had crossed in the same space, in the same moment, but each went his own way. The judge realized that his actions would haunt him for the rest of his days. He knew he couldn't go back to the life he once knew. Everything had changed. He had become someone who challenged the system, someone who chose to be part of truth rather than power. But what was the price for that? He didn't know, and he may never know. The outside world had not changed. It remained just as violent, with the same racism, the same violence. But even though the trial was over, James and Judge Lawson knew one thing. Something had begun. Something had changed in their souls. Their battle with the system was not over. and it will not end. The system is too strong for it to just collapse from one verdict. Too many people, like the cops, were willing to support it, to exonerate it. But James knew that if he fought, even if his chances were slim, he would make it. He realized that truth isn't something you can just reach out and get. It had to be wrestled away. And even though his situation had changed, he was willing to continue that fight. As he walked down the street, lifting his gaze to the heavens, he felt a light breeze touch his face. It wasn't a victory, just a new phase, a new path that was beginning. Judge Lawson could stare into the void, but James knew that his judgments were only accumulating, which meant he needed to be ready for the next step. This story is not finished. It continues. What do you think about this story? Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and comments are very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Please write how you felt about this story, and don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and we'd love to see your comments. Wishing you a good day. Write the phrase, "The truth always wins," so we know you're listening to the end.